Hi, everyone.
Everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to Accessibility Talks, the monthly virtual meetup where we chat about digital accessibility, inclusivity, and usability. Each month, we invite a speaker to present a topic, and afterward, we invite the community to ask questions and participate in the discussion. I'm today's host, Heather New. I'm a freelance developer and designer with a passion for accessibility. I want to take a moment to remind folks that our group seeks to provide a friendly, safe environment. We require that all participants adhere to the Accessibility Talks Code of Conduct. This applies to all community interactions and events, as well as the chat and the text channels. This code of conduct can be found on our website, A11yTalks.com, A11yTalks.com. All participants should be able to engage in productive dialogue and should share and learn with each other in an atmosphere of mutual respect. To engage in conversation, or if you have any questions for our speaker, please post it on Twitter with the hashtag A11yTalks or Ally Talks. You can also post in the chat window, and if you're participating in the live chat. I am thrilled to be hosting our speaker, Anna Cook, today. She will discuss why we need more accessibility designers, what it takes to be an accessibility designer, and the day-to-day responsibilities of an accessibility designer. So learn how you can advocate to create accessibility designer roles and begin to train yourself to specialize in accessibility as a designer. Meet Anna Cook, who is a senior accessibility designer at Northwest Mutual.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for the introduction, Heather. I really appreciate it. All right, so let's get into it together today. I am going to make sure everything's set up. Perfect. So welcome to our chat about why we need more accessibility designers. I am so excited to join as a guest for A11y Talks and to get to chat with you all about the growing and important field of accessibility and inclusivity in design. Now, before we get started, I'll tell you just a little bit about myself, though Heather was had a great introduction. My name is Anna Cook. I use the pronouns she, her, or they, them. I'm really comfortable with either. I'm a senior accessibility designer at Northwestern Mutual and a master's student at the Atlas Institute of CU Boulder. In academia and industry alike, I've chosen to specialize in designing experiences that are as inclusive as possible, focusing on accessibility in particular. I'm also currently working on a book about accessibility and inclusivity for digital designers, which I'm hoping to have out by next September, though, fingers crossed, writing a book is kind of hard sometimes, and but I'm working on a book, so that's pretty cool. In my free time, I draw, I play video games, and I hike, and I cuddle with my cats too. I have 2 cats. If they are in the background or if you hear a yowl today, it's because they like to be chatty and make noise when I'm making noise. So apologies if you hear them. Or you're welcome, depending on if you like cats. So today we're going to discuss why we need more accessibility designers, but also why we haven't had many accessibility designers up until recently. We'll get into what it means to be an accessibility designer and how you might begin to ramp up your skill set. Now, I will mention we won't have time to discuss why accessibility matters or the business case for accessibility today. Now, that's not to say that these subjects are not important, but rather my hope is that you're coming to this presentation knowing that accessibility matters and understanding that there is strategic value, that comes from having accessibility integrated in your organization's strategy. So for the purposes of our discussion today, we're going to focus on accessibility in designers so that we can really dig in together. To start us off, I wanted to take a few moments to discuss why we don't already have more people with the title of accessibility designer or even inclusivity designer. Because up until recently, titles like these were rare or even unheard of, even though we've known about accessibility for decades. Well, when I started my career back in 2012, I didn't know a role like mine could ever exist, let alone when it meant to be an accessibility designer or how to be one. And although I have the title and responsibilities of an accessibility designer now, this is a relatively new development in my career. I've been in design jobs for nearly 10 years, aging myself a little bit there, but for nearly 10 years, which is wild. I even had the title of the formal title, of accessibility designer until 2021. I've been a web designer, UX designer, and product designer working with web applications, native applications, websites, and all things in between there. I didn't learn about accessibility in most of my design classes or even before my first design job. Heck, I wasn't even asked to prioritize accessibility in a lot of my career. The only reasons I was able to learn about accessibility was because I chose to do so, made time to do so, and had the resources available to me to do that. Resources that others don't always have the privilege of having. I was exposed to accessibility relatively early in my career, largely by coincidence, and I happened to be fascinated. Uh, so I took the time to integrate that into my specialty, into my practice as a designer. But that's not how it should be. Designers should be able to understand basic accessibility by default. The thing is, very few designers are exposed to the importance and practice of accessible design. We are rarely asked to make time for it, learn about it, or practice it. But why is that? Well, my experience is rare in some ways in that I was exposed to accessibility early, but in others, it's actually pretty consistent. In August of this year, I conducted a survey using Twitter asking digital designers to self identify how much they felt they were taught about accessibility when they went through their education. Now, that education could be a university program like higher education, a boot camp, self teaching, any of those methods, all valid. 1,311 designers responded over the course of 7 days. 8% said they had a lot of accessibility education. 34% said they had a little accessibility education. And 58% said they had no accessibility education. That means over half of designers out there today had no accessibility education. And those who did often felt they only had a little. Anecdotally, the folks who told me they felt like they had a lot or even a little often were being taught in institutions or settings that were closely integrated with architectural and industrial design. So digital design settings have largely, up until recently, and even still, not been teaching designers about accessibility design practices. So we know designers at least feel unprepared to handle accessibility in design. But why? What is happening? How are our educational institutions struggling to meet this need? Now, in higher education, 50% of institutions across the United States said they had faculty teaching accessibility in their human computer interaction and tech/design related programs. Yet those faculty were most likely to identify themselves as only having some knowledge of accessibility. Of the surveyed faculty, 10.7% said they were not knowledgeable. 66.1% said they had some knowledge. 18.7% said that they were knowledgeable, and only 4.5% said that they were experts. Now, we would expect, particularly in a higher education setting, that a larger portion of faculty teaching students about accessibility would identify themselves as having knowledgeable or expert levels of education around accessibility. It is worth noting, however, that the Dunning-Kruger effect may affect how faculty judge their expertise, as many experts can struggle to identify themselves as such. But regardless, between these two surveys, and others like them that often have similar results, we know that digital designers are entering the workforce feeling underprepared to handle accessibility considerations. We also know educational institutions are still ramping up their digital accessibility programs, but aren't preparing designers enough quite yet. So why hasn't accessibility been prioritized in our education? Well, there could be many reasons for this. Now, part of them are related to widespread lack of understanding around disability rights, accessibility, and ableism that can be highly embedded in our systems and institutions. And certainly that, I think, plays a role in this. But there's also quite likely a possibility that educational institutions are responding to a lack of demand in industry. Many organizations have struggled to implement digital accessibility practice or policy, even though guidelines for this, specifically the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, have existed since 1999. That's over 20 years, which makes me feel old, but it's been over 20 years since we've had WCAG. When organizations have created digital accessibility policies, it's often been in response to lawsuits, meaning that teams are far more reactive than proactive. So when that happens, we end up finding that things are more, that they're more, again, remediation of tactics rather than being holistic accessibility policy and practice. Many organizations have looked at accessibility as a matter of compliance first. So hiring accessibility roles and skills has been fairly rare, at least until this point, and often reactionary. So we are now starting to see actually this shift, and where accessibility skills for designers are being seen as more important, and roles like mine are being created more and more. Now, according to a study referenced by Teach Access, 93% of industry leaders like Apple, Microsoft, Google, and more say that industry demand for accessibility skills is actually going to increase. And this is important because this data was, this survey was created in 2018, which is, wow, nearly 4 years ago. Time is funny these days, but that was 4 years ago. So what's probably happening is that this is already shifting, and it's likely going to continue to shift. That demand is going to exist and continue to grow. It's also important to note that up until recently, the expectation was that testing and development teams were the main accessibility resources. This is because early on in digital accessibility advocacy, accessibility was intentionally prioritized in testing. It needed to be something practical, immediately applicable, and measurable. The focus was on testing first because testers could find issues and measure them, gather them together, and notice them as a trend. But then that made it so that accessibility considerations were always afterthoughts and remediations that could only be fixed after development occurred. And this amplified the cost and time to put in accessibility considerations significantly, requiring teams to go back, redevelop entire projects, and redevelop entire systems. Advocates then began prioritizing accessibility checks during development, but that still wasn't enough. The same issues would occur when emphasizing accessibility testing in development first. It would require teams to go back and redesign whole projects and systems. The thing about emphasizing accessibility during testing or even development alone is that designs have already been prepared and handed off. Even in more fluid, agile, prepared teams, designs have already been thoroughly tested, vetted, prototyped, all of that. So when it reaches this stage, we would have to redesign, refactor a lot to make sure that we have accessibility considerations. And in many cases, accessibility issues would be baked into those designs, making it difficult and impossible even for developers to fix. In a study conducted by DQ, they found that 67% of accessibility issues can actually originate in design with us. So developers and testers were disempowered to fix everything, and many of the things that they could fix required special workarounds. When we prioritized testing and development only, we were still making accessibility a remediation and reactive tactic. Now we're looking to shift accessibility left into design and product requirements. Developers cannot outcode inaccessible designs. Testers can document issues, but they can't fix them holistically. Neither of these teams can make an experience holistically accessible on their own. Holistic accessibility requires dedicated support from all team members, all parties. It requires everyone to be engaged, educated, and involved. Otherwise, accessibility is always going to be a costly afterthought. So that's kind of why we don't have many accessibility designers yet, though I'm sure there are some more factors that come into play as well. Let's talk about why we need more accessibility-focused designers. Well, as I mentioned earlier, 67% of accessibility issues can originate in design. And the cost of fixing accessibility from design mistakes can be amplified as issues move across a product cycle. It can take 6 times longer to fix defects in development, 12 times longer to fix them in testing, and 30 times longer to fix them in production. And that applies to any defect, accessibility related or not. We always thought, or the bias about accessibility is that it's too expensive to have baked into our product. But perhaps the reason that accessibility is perceived as expensive is because when accessibility is an afterthought, it costs significantly more. To address this, we need to integrate accessibility into design considerations and look at users' needs, not just technical requirements. In digital products, when we encounter any type of problem, we look to our product owners and designers to understand that problem, research solutions, ideate on concepts, and test those concepts with users. We do this so that we can evaluate our ideas before they're built, to build what works and spend our time and money effectively. The same should apply to accessibility. Designers and product teams must help bake accessibility into a product lifecycle for it to be proactive about accessibility rather than reactive. It will save time and money while creating valuable and effective functionality like all design work can. But then you might be wondering, right? What accessibility considerations should actually live in design? Well, rest assured, accessibility considerations are far more than color contrast for design teams. Well, let's look at this together using the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines as, no pun intended, as a guide. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the WCAG are a universally accepted set of standards describing how to make online and digital materials more accessible to disabled people. When we look at the latest version of these guidelines, version 2.1, how many of them actually relate to design? Shell Little, who actually presented at A11yTalks a few months ago and broke this down, is the inclusive design lead for Wells Fargo, and she did this using WCAG 2.1. Shell assessed this as if in the situation where there was a QA bug, asking herself, who would need to be in the room to be a decision maker for a bug relating to this guideline? Assessing WCAG for both A and AA levels of acceptance, Shell found that 64% of those criteria were related to design, 22% were related specifically to development, and 14% were related to both. Now, these exact percentages can be debated, obviously, but I reviewed how Shell assessed this, and I personally agree a lot with her assessment. And Shell's amazing, by the way. Super cool person. Thinking back to how 67% of accessibility issues can originate in design, right? That data we got from DQ. It doesn't seem odd to me that 64% of criteria are design specific, right? These percentages are too similar to me to be coincidental. When looking at the WCAG criteria related to design, we can even match guidelines to certain roles and responsibilities. 18 of these criteria can apply to interaction design, 14 to content design, and 7 to visual design. So let's take a look at how these criteria could break into these different roles and responsibilities. Now, I'm not going to have the exact WCAG numbers listed here because it's a lot of visual noise, but all the things I'm mentioning here are specifically tied back to WCAG. Now, for interaction designers, we're considering moving parts, right? We're looking at how an experience ties together, user flows, interactions, the capabilities that live within a whole system. We consider things like what interactions are going to incur and what happens when a user does this and what should happen when a user does this. Interaction designers can consider things including animation, things like reduced motion settings, bypass blocks like skip navigation, focus and hover states, layout, navigation and navigability across an experience, pointer gestures such as pinch and zoom. I'm doing the gestures here. Sorry, pointer gestures, tab order and reading order, right? And timing and timeouts. All of these relate back to WCAG. For content designers, like the amazing ones I work with, we focus on accessible alternatives like alt text and captioning and transcripts, making sure that content is able to be digested even if it's visual or video for folks who are blind, who are low vision, who are deaf or hard of hearing. We also look at accessible structure and taxonomy through headings, page titles, and purposeful link and button text. Content designers also play a huge role in clear labels, instructions, and making sure errors are clearly identified and improvements, ways to fix those errors, are being suggested to users. Visual designers create color systems with relational colors and sufficient color contrast, and use color with other visual indicators, not relying on color alone, as it were. They also support consistent visual identification related to things like iconography, typography, and legibility. Many of the visual elements that the visual designers create branch upwards and outwards to visual interface designs and interaction capabilities as well. Now, keep in mind that all of these roles, right, as designers, I've found I've done all of these things in different parts of my life, whether it be because of a title or because of a project or a situation. So while we can group these types of things into different specific roles and responsibilities, you may find as a designer that you're doing bits and pieces of this at any given time. The most important thing to keep in mind about all of this is that there are very real accessibility considerations that must be considered by designers. And that, again, is beyond just color contrast alone. So we know that accessibility design positions have been rare. And we know right now that we need more accessibility designers. But then what does an accessibility designer do exactly? Well, every organization has different expectations for designers, right? The same is going to be true for accessibility and inclusivity designers. Now, my experience as an accessibility designer official accessibility designer has been in a larger scale organization with multiple product teams and 80 plus designers. So do keep in mind that when I talk about what goes into being an accessibility designer considerations, that's going to be from the lens of the scale of the organization I'm at. These things can still scale down for smaller organizations, so be mindful that they can apply a little differently in different contexts. Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that no matter how mature your accessibility organization is, accessibility designers are always going to be advocating. Even when you've got leadership buy-in, you will always find that there are new people coming in, new leaders moving around, things are happening. People collectively will always need to learn about why accessibility matters and why it fits into the business strategy or organizational strategy. We're always advocating because we need to be teaching people as a whole why accessibility is important, because it is important. We want them to be bought in so that they can help us move this initiative forward. We're also advocating because, like any team, we want to be sure we're creating roles, getting funding for certain resources and tools, and making sure that we can prioritize what we do against other responsibilities. Advocacy also means finding ways to standardize accessibility practices in our products themselves, across an organization, with employees and for employees, and with partners and vendors. Because an accessibility strategy doesn't just end with a product. We want to make sure that a holistic customer experience is accessible as much as possible. And we want to make sure that our employees are empowered with the same tools that empower all folks with accessibility when it comes to accessibility. We also want to make sure that when we're partnering with other organizations, that we're doing things to make sure that those partnerships create accessible solutions. Now, all of these can include accessibility governance, policies, statements, and creating and requiring things called voluntary product accessibility templates, or VPATs. Even with the title of accessibility designer, there's always going to be a need to navigate enterprise adoption and advocate for accessibility. And you'll find in some organizations there are more leads who are taking on this position, but in a large part, you're going to always be teaching and advocating for accessibility until, hopefully one day, accessibility is truly ubiquitously understood as a priority. Accessibility designers also need to be able to support product teams when dealing with more complex questions. Even when we've created the frameworks, systems, tools, and baseline knowledge to make designs more accessible, there are always going to be situations that arise within product teams that require more advanced and specialized expertise. Now, Matt May has been known to say this, but I think it's a perfect quote for this situation. We have a few people right now that know a lot about accessibility, and what we need is a lot of people who know a little bit about it so that we have a baseline knowledge, and then specialists and advocates and subject matter experts can help answer those more complex questions. So accessibility designers will also partner with product teams and individual designers to review designs, collaborate, ideate, and influence research. With a baseline knowledge, designers are actually better prepared to ask questions about the experience to consider accessibility, and they usually are better prepared to answer them. But we want to make sure that those designers are always supported with somebody who can come in and help them answer those more advanced questions. In a more mature accessibility organization, each team might have an embedded accessibility design specialist to do this and have a lead guiding them. Other organizations approach this by having accessibility design guilds, where a group of folks from each team come together and talk about accessibility across a broader organization. And this can be handled in a few different ways. In a less mature or smaller organization, smaller and less mature in terms of accessibility, accessibility designers might find themselves being sort of like an in-house consultant and a mentor. They will go to different product teams, help work through different projects and processes, answer questions coming in, and the like. Then, when it comes to scaling accessibility in design, if you heard a mew, that's my cat, accessibility designers involve ourselves in design operations. We want to make sure that accessibility design considerations don't fall on a single person or a small group alone, because that usually means that that small group or that individual is being stretched really thin, and it can be very difficult for them to meet needs across an organization that way, and it can lead to burnout. So we need designers, as we've talked about, across an organization to have a baseline knowledge, skills, and the tools to make their work accessible. So we start, and this Matt May quote relates to this one too. So we start by preparing our teams, right, with a shared set of knowledge, expertise, expectations, and guidelines. Now, as we discussed, most designers, right, have not been trained to understand how to make their work accessible. And that hopefully is going to change. But right now, designers aren't fully prepared to manage this. So accessibility designers help fill those gaps in knowledge by creating training series and tools. This means introducing designers to what it means to design with disabled users in mind, reframing design thinking, into practicing inclusive design thinking. It's about re-strategizing and reframing the way we work. We also want to introduce digital designers to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, help them understand what guidelines apply to their practice, and give them ways to review their work. And in design situations, a lot of what we do tends to be a little bit more manual. And that's because we're, working on complex ideas and solutions, whereas developers can use more automated solutions. So things like this are especially important with design teams because we have to give them frameworks and reference points to actually look through their work and think through these problems, which is part of the reason that, right now a lot of designers are probably perceiving color contrast as the biggest thing they can do. It's an automated way to check, but a lot of accessibility in design is like a lot of all design. It requires us to think through solutions, ideas, and problems. So the goal of having training and tools is to set up our designers with that set of knowledge and then give them the best tools to apply that knowledge. Similarly, we want to empower designers by supporting an accessible design system. Design system accessibility is a key aspect of scaling accessibility within an organization, and that applies both to design and to development and to testing. Design systems are powerful tools. Now, accessibility designers should be involved with reviewing existing components and documenting what needs to be fixed. We also should be involved with ensuring new components and patterns are reviewed for accessibility considerations before release. Now, this is especially crucial because when we release components with accessibility gaps, we can be creating a huge amount of accessibility issues that get amplified across products. And it can be harder to fix them because dependencies get created and then we end up with breaking changes. So accessibility designers should be involved in design system processes to make sure that that is being addressed as much as possible and as early as possible. Accessibility designers should also be involved in design system documentation to ensure that designers know how to apply these components in a way that considers accessibility. Because even with a perfectly accessible design system out of the box, if a designer has that system and they're using components in a way that is inaccessible, accessibility issues can emerge still. So we want to make sure that we have a baseline system that supports them to start with and give them the implementation details to understand how to make sure that what they're funneling that into their practice holistically. Now, I realize these responsibilities might sound like a lot, and it can be, but these responsibilities can be broken out in many different ways. In organizations with a less mature accessibility organization, a principal or senior designer may manage it independently to help scale that maturity. And having those senior and principal skill sets, it can be a little easier to do that. Whereas in a more mature organization in terms of accessibility, they may have more junior and mid-level team members to contribute where they can be, funneling up to a lead or senior or principal. Now, this is just part of the reason that accessibility designers right now tend to be, a little bit more senior and they tend to be a little bit more principal because a lot of us are still leveling up maturity within our organizations to create the ability to have those mid and juniors and have them be supported collectively. So We know that accessibility designers haven't really existed, and we know that they should exist, and we kind of get a sense of how they should look like. But maybe you're wondering how to be an accessibility designer. Yes, I hope you are, because I'd love to see more of us out there. Now, I want to mention that you don't need to be a senior or a principal designer now to start practicing these skills. You don't have to be certified to be qualified. I started integrating accessibility in my design practice as a junior designer. And from there, it served me a lot when I was looking for jobs, because that is a skill set that is still very rare and has huge benefits. The reality is, you don't have to have the title or be seeking the title of accessibility designer to make your designs more accessible. You don't have to be looking to get that title you don't have to be looking to get that official title to benefit from the skills that come with accessibility practice in design. Now, I know that my understanding of accessibility has given me a major competitive advantage as a designer whenever I was looking for a position throughout my career. And I know it's made me a better designer because it's changed how I think about design. It means that I'm better able, now not to toot my own horn, but I'm better able to hand off those designs and work with developers because I understand what facets of design are translating into semantic code, what ways we need to be considering what is being built so that it's being built accessibly and holistically. So those things really work well, and they're great skills to have no matter what your long-term goals are. So if you want to get started, here are some tips. First and most importantly, as designers, our job is to understand people, their needs, and their problems. The same is true for ensuring experiences are more accessible. We need to be listening to disabled people. A part of the reason why we have perceived accessibility as a set of technical requirements is because up until now, right, design hasn't been as integrated into this practice. But this is a great time to change that. Accessibility is a form of design. It's about people. It's about users. So we learn from these users the same way we learn from all users. We want to take time to change this so that we can really think about accessibility about when it comes to people. So how we do this is not through things like empathy exercises. I cannot understand what it means to be blind by closing my eyes and practicing with a screen reader for a day. It's not the same thing. An empathy exercise can only get us so far. It really is limiting because it means that we can open our eyes at any time. We can change the way that we're interacting with that experience, and we don't have that lived experience of having a disability. So we need to listen. We need to actually take the time to learn what it's like to interact with digital experiences when having a disability. It's not enough to do an empathy exercise. We really have to really listen to users the way we listen to all users. By taking that time, there are many ways we can start to change how we think about our design practice. Now, I have 2 videos in here that were both free and came up within Google within 5 minutes. One of a user, or an individual, I should say, using a screen reader, and the other of somebody using a mouth stick to interact with their iPad. The tools like this exist and they're ubiquitous. And actually, there's plenty of people out there. Like heck, on TikTok, I was watching a video earlier today of somebody using a screen reader. So there are many ways to just learn directly from people who have disabilities and begin thinking about what they need. There's a link in here that I've also included that I will make sure you all have access to later. And that's going to go to W3's considerations for people. Now, secondly, it's recommended that you start getting familiar with checking your work using WCAG. Now, again, these guidelines are really important, but it's also really good to know that they've been created by and with people who have disabilities. So they are a form of listening and hearing what disabled users need. It's an important part of making our work more accessible. And honestly, it's part of the way I learned what needs to be done and how it might be done and who might do it. I honestly would use this quick reference guide. I still use this guide. I would open it up, look through each of the items, and kind of go through it in my designs and say, does this relate to my design? Do I need to account for this? How do I account for this? What is missing here? And starting there is a great place to start, because over time you'll find you're kind of getting more familiar with patterns and things that need to exist, and you'll start memorizing. Just the way it's kind of like studying, but studying in practice. It can take, now I will mention that it can take time to get used to this, and sometimes WCAG can be difficult to understand. So know that you don't have to start out as an expert, just be ready to use it as a reference point and start to become familiar with it. And if you prefer something simpler to start, the A11y project has a checklist that is a great resource and very, very clear to start. Third, as designers, research is a core part of how we work. We could not be designers if we were not listening to users or gathering feedback. So I want to encourage you to begin becoming comfortable with inclusive research strategies. Inclusive research strategies can be handled by user researchers, but also collective design teams can come together and learn from a diverse set of users and advocate for inclusive research. It can take time to set up those strategies, and I will mention that one of my personal goals is to get better at understanding ways to make a research practice inclusive and include disabled people in our process of learning about our product and making it a point to do regular research. But I advocate for us to start thinking about this early, because research is a core part of our work as designers. So in here, I've included a practical research guide from the Inclusive Research Collective that just started, I believe, this year, and that's on Medium. Inclusive research can make all of the difference, and not just making an experience accessible, but also making it inclusive, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. Referencing guidelines like what I have shared here, which again, I will share later, can be a great place to start. Fourth, as we discussed, all designers should have a baseline knowledge, or rather, I'm struggling with my words, a baseline understanding of accessibility. And you can empower fellow designers to make their work more accessible too. It takes a whole group of folks to really consider accessibility. It can't just live with one person. So sharing that knowledge is super important. And that's part of the reason that, that I have gotten to where I'm at. I've presented accessibility design workshops for years with coworkers and colleagues, and of course, in settings like this. In the picture here, this is from, I think, 2 years ago, and I was presenting how to do automated and manual review using tools like GQ's Axe plugin, or sorry, Axe. Sorry, there we go. Now, oftentimes these were great opportunities for me to actually learn and for my peers to learn with me. So presenting and putting together, more workshops and presentations is a great way not only for you to learn, but for everybody to learn. Empower your team with that knowledge, and they can help make the product more accessible across different sources of design. And finally, make it known that you want to be an accessibility-focused designer. But part of the reason I really moved into this specialty is because one day my manager and I, it feels like decades ago, but years ago, sat down and I told them that this is what I wanted. I remember talking about how that might look and how I could do that within my current team. Make it known. Say, this is my interest. This is what I'm interested in. How can I make this happen? You can do this by informing your team, working with your managers, practicing the skills, and building a portfolio with robust accessibility considerations baked in. Even if your design work, has limitations, as all design projects tend to have, even if they're not perfectly accessible, showing how you integrated accessibility into your design practice is a great place to start. It also just shows that you're willing and able to take the time to look at accessibility as a designer. It's helped me a lot, so I definitely recommend it. Now, again, you may have noticed throughout this section that I included links and resources, which again, I'll make sure are available to you all later. And I've also got a few more in here. Now, Adobe is working on an inclusive design workshop that I believe is supposed to come out in June of, I believe, next year. The link here is going to go to that. Microsoft has an amazing inclusive design toolkit and set of references and videos about about people who have disabilities and how they interact with digital experiences and physical experiences alike. I've included BBC's GEL, Global Experience Language, because BBC has a long track record of including accessibility in design. The A11y project, which I mentioned earlier, which is a great resource and has that checklist. And I've got a list of top people to follow in here as well, because accessibility advocacy has a lot of really cool people that are just so cool to follow. I highly recommend just, learning from them directly. Now, the last thing I'd like to mention is the difference between an accessibility designer and an inclusivity designer, because I've used both of these terms throughout this presentation, and I want to take a moment to acknowledge it. Now, these are developing definitions for these roles, but I do think they currently encapsulate what is happening with both types of roles and responsibilities. You'll find that there are accessibility designers and also inclusivity designers, and they can have overlapping roles and responsibilities. They tend to look a little bit different, and they tend to be adopted by different types of maturity, different types of organizations who have more or less accessibility maturity. But by and large, I see accessibility designers as primarily focused on designing experiences that are accessible for and with disabled people. Often, roles like accessibility designers can turn into inclusivity design roles when an organization has higher levels of maturity, and they can start looking at making sure not only that experiences are not only accessible, but also inclusive of gender diversity, racial diversity, and other forms of inclusivity. They think about equity. Inclusivity designers think about broader equity within a product and experience. Inclusivity designers still focus on accessibility, but they also focus on it past a level of compliance and tend to look at not only having the experience be accessible, but also be highly usable and delightful for folks who have disabilities. And again, these are working definitions and they certainly can be debated. I did check with a few folks who have similar titles to my own on this, but know that I'm sure that these will develop and change as all titles and roles do. Now, with that in mind, I wanted to take, time to answer questions and have a discussion with everybody.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Anna. We've got some questions from our viewers. Where do you sit within the organization structure? Are you still in the UX team overall?
That's a great question. And this can look a little different, of course, depending on the organization. Right now, I am sort of living in a role where I'm overseeing accessibility for designers across our organization, but I'm embedded from an operational standpoint within our design systems team. And so that may change. Some folks early on start that way, and I've seen that happening with other organizations as well, and then eventually have a dedicated individual accessibility team. So that's where I'm at now, and that may vary according to organization.
Where can we find information's resource how to design for cognitive disabilities? And this is a sub-expertise of an accessibility designer.
Oh, I love this question because some of the greatest things that we can do as accessibility designers is create experiences that are, and I'm going to go on a slight tangent, that are accessible for folks who have cognitive disabilities and for folks who are neurodiverse. And this is especially important because we're in an era, right, where folks are dealing with a lot of different folks are more likely to be cognitive or diagnosed with cognitive disabilities and be neurodiverse and the like. But where folks can find resources, there are a few things out there in terms of guides. I know that some folks are working on or have created articles and posts about this. I know we have a few. Shell Little has presented on this before. Tolu, who works at Shopify, is doing an AxCon presentation about this. Excuse me. So I would say the long story short is I would do a little bit of searching around, but there are accessibility advocates who are starting to talk about this, and it is going to be better integrated into some of the large tech companies' practices in the future. So keep an eye on those companies and look at that list for the folks to follow, because some folks are already talking about this and have already created guides. And I'll make sure to share some of these too later so that folks can have like links and stuff.
Fantastic. How will WCAG 3.0 impact designs for apps and websites going forward? How can we learn more about that?
Well, an interesting thing about WCAG 3.0 to keep in mind is that we have a while before that is ready to come out. Right now, what's happening is that the WCAG 2.2, actually, I believe it got pushed into next year when it was originally planned to be released this year. And so the first thing I want to mention to keep in mind is that we would want to focus on 2.2 first, just because that's what we know is more likely to happen and it's a little bit more vetted and thorough. Excuse me, gosh, I'm stuttering. What we are seeing is an emphasis on more. There are definitely things like making sure that focus states are clearly perceived with different forms of color contrast. There are things like making sure that we have not only a AAA level for selection and target area, but a AA level for selection and target area. That being things like making sure somebody has enough of an area to select, right? Like when you're using your phone, you can make sure that you've got enough area. Things like that are coming up in 2.2. More details and more considerations are definitely worth looking into for 2.2. I will mention that one of the hottest topics right at this current moment is color contrast evaluation methods. It has been discussed that in 3.0 there may be a new method. That being said, again, we are a long way out from 3.0. And so I tend to recommend, if you're curious about what's coming, look at 2.2 first and focus on that first. And know that things will come when they're ready to come to us.
Yeah, sometimes it's in baby steps, but it's good that there's progress moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, well, in WCAG, like, to keep in mind, things do move a bit slowly because it's an international network and things are being reviewed and evaluated collectively by a lot of folks. And so getting consensus and building this knowledge, it takes time. Now, there are things that I'm sure can improve about any system or network, but just know that that's why things are really well vetted in that program. And in WCAG, because of how many people and how well validated it is.
Is there an app or a website that you have used that has impressed you with accessibility recently?
Impressed me with accessibility. Well, I would say one of my favorites, of course, is the A11y project. They did a redesign, I think, in 2020, but I think really touches on the intersection between like things looking beautiful and being accessible. And I think I'm hoping there'll be more and more experiences like that so that designers can begin to understand that accessibility isn't utility only. It can be beautiful. It can be amazingly designed. So that's the first one that comes to mind. I, of course, my experience is going to be different than others. I'm always thinking about experiences that work for me as somebody with dyslexia. And so things I've been noticing or working well there was debate around this, but personally, I thought the Twitter font was more readable. Other folks did not feel that way. But I would say that my list of amazing accessible design experiences is feeling a little short at the moment because there's still such a big gap, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you said in your personal life, kind of accessibility is everywhere, right? So one of your hobbies to do in your off time is to play video games. What are a couple interesting accessibility features that you have found while playing the video games?
Oh, I love this question. I'm always watching if you're curious about accessibility design, and the hottest thing, the coolest thing that's happening right now is what video game designers are doing. There's a lot of cool stuff happening. For me, as a gamer, what I notice a lot, like the other day I was playing Outer Worlds, which is like a space RPG. And Outer Worlds has the teeniest, tiniest font by default. And I was watching, I cannot remember their last name, Steve, who does like reviews of video games, and he's a blind gamer. And he was talking about how they had just updated that. They had released an accessibility update to make that type be able to be bigger, for example. I've also noticed things like accessibility isn't just in video games about like type size or color application, but also about enabling a game to be easier to play. And this is such an interesting subject to me. I play games to enjoy the game. I don't care if I'm really good at it. I just want to play the game. So things like that are really important to me as a gamer because I want to be able to just like, I wish I could play Dark Souls, but it's really, really hard. And I wish they had an easier mode. So stuff like that I notice personally. There's a lot of, I will mention that before I ramble on and on about this, Microsoft did just release a game design accessibility training series that's free, which is awesome. And to keep an eye, there was a set of awards that happened last week. I think Forza got an award. I know that the games like Last of Us have gotten awards. Miles Morales got awards, stuff like that. Sorry, I'm geeking out. I love video game accessibility.
That's awesome. I mean, I've seen remote controls where they adapt and actually the physical world. So I think that's really awesome to involve more people.
Yeah, I should mention, sorry, I got too excited. Microsoft's adaptive controller is one of the coolest forms of accessibility I've seen. They really did something amazing there. And I just recommend looking at some review videos and seeing how disabled gamers use that because it's so cool. And Microsoft even recently released a set of other physical things that people can put on their computer, the physical computer, to make accessible. Okay, I'm done being really nerdy. I'm sorry. It's really cool stuff.
It is cool. Thank you so much for sharing all the stats, the opportunity options that are out there, and all that information, joining us. Also, thank you to the viewers who turned in and engaged in the chat today. We're going to post the links available later when the YouTube video is posted online. Remember to join us next month to talk about more things accessibility. As a reminder, we're always recruiting new speakers. We always make a conscious effort to include marginalized groups in tech in our speaker lineup. So please let us know if you have ideas on how to make Ally Talks more friendly to all. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to never miss a talk, or follow us on Twitter, twitter.com, A11yTalks. Thank you so much, Anna.
Bye.